Welcome to our second session of Christ Episcopal Church's Lenten teaching on Johann Sebastian Bach's St. Matthew's Passion. My name's Bill Duxbury, and I'm going to be leading you through a few more sessions as we take a look at what is obviously one of the great musical masterpieces of Western music, and that is Johann Sebastian Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Now, if this is your first time, I would encourage you to go back to the website, the church website, and find the link that'll take you through the first presentation that I made. We're going to assume that a lot of the material there you already know as we move forward, and I think you'll find it most helpful if you go through the first session. Also, for any of you, if you have not downloaded the PDF file there, on that you will find a handout which includes everything from a translation from German into English of this work. It includes many notes that I've compiled together, many of the biography of Bach that we're going to be talking about today, and lots of other good stuff there. So if you want to download that and follow along, you're going to find that most helpful as we do it. At the end of the last session, I promised a pop quiz. So, without further ado, let's get to it. So how'd you do? Did anybody get all of them right? Did anybody get none of them right? Well, obviously much of this is tongue-in-cheek, but let's just, so that we're all on the same page, do a quick review of some of the things that we talked about in our first session. The first thing is, what were the major themes that Bach incorporated into the St. Matthew Passion? Okay, and we said that there was 5 major themes. The first theme was that mankind is sinful and is incapable of being good enough. The second one was that Jesus, as both God and man, was sinless. The third major theme that Bach brought into the Passion was Jesus loved us so much that he wanted to die for us. The fourth theme was that it was necessary for the sinless Jesus to shed blood and die in order to redeem mankind. And then the fifth and last theme that he brings in is we should be thankful. We should be thankful to Jesus for his shedding of blood. Now, we also mentioned that there are other Christian themes that are not brought up in the Passion, and that's very appropriate for the Passion. There's things such as redemption. There's things such as the resurrection or the Pentecost. All of these themes are not brought up, and that's very intentional by Bach, because St. Matthew Passion, along with every Passion, is designed for Good Friday. Good Friday is when we commemorate Jesus' crucifixion on the cross. On Good Friday, there has yet to be an Easter. There has yet to be a Pentecost. All of these things are in the future. They are not here in the present. So the Passion is to remind us of all these Christian tenets of faith that happen up until Good Friday. Now we'll get to them eventually when we get to his Easter cantata. If you listen to that, you will see all of these other Christian themes brought up really well. The other thing we talked about in our first session was some of the musical elements that Bach uses throughout the St. Matthew Passion. And we said that there were 4 major musical elements. The first is recitative. Recitative is a narrative style of singing that tends to mimic the human voice. If somebody is trying to be slow and methodical, then the singing might be slow and methodical. If somebody is agitated and exciting, then it might be quick. It might be sort of shotgunish, okay? So it mimics the human voice in many ways. The recitative throughout St. Matthew Passion, we said, all comes word for word from the Martin Luther translation of the German, of St. Matthew into German, word for word. The next thing that we saw was arias. Arias are an individual reaction to the narration, to the action. It's a pause in the action that allows us to reflect or to ponder what this might mean to us as individuals. Similar to an aria, we have the chorus. The chorus fulfills multiple roles throughout this Passion. Oftentimes it's a group reaction. How do we as a group react to the events that are unfolding? The chorus also acts as God's people. They might also act as all the priests and the scribes. They may act as the angry mob. They sometimes will switch roles almost within a heartbeat. So the chorus plays out as a group role. And then lastly is chorales. Chorales, which we would probably call hymns, were hymns from the Lutheran hymnal that the church there at Leipzig had, that these were all familiar to them. These were hymns that they sung Sunday in and Sunday out as part of their normal worship service, just as we have hymns that we're familiar with. This had the impact of drawing the people, the listeners, into the action. This meant it was no longer just something that might have happened 2,000 years ago, but rather this was something that we can relate to here and now. Now that we've done a review of some of the parts of St. Matthew's Passion, some of the various musical numbers that Bach uses, it's probably way past due for us to get to know this composer, to get to know Johann Sebastian Bach. So I'll just give you a very brief biography. We can't go into the details that I'd really like to, but that's okay. Johann Sebastian Bach was born into a musical family in north-central Germany in 1685. At the age of 10, both his mother and father died within 8 months of each other. His oldest brother took him in, which was the tradition of the time. That was quite normal. Bach would have been known through his family as Sebastian. It was normal that you'd use your middle name as the name that people would call you by. Bach grew up in post-Reformation Germany. At this time, there were 2 major expressions of the Church Reformation. There was the Lutheran faith, which believed in a rich musical component to worship. And then there was the Calvinistic faith that believed in a more spare musical worship. Fortunately for us, Bach developed a deep Lutheran Reformation faith. Bach was growing up in what we would call the Baroque period. They wouldn't have called it that at their time. We don't call what period we're in by anything. It's for historians to do that. One of the influence that was going on in the Baroque period was also the Enlightenment. We had figures such as Newton and Hume and Locke and Bacon. They were all expressing a more empirical, rational, ordered way of looking at the world. And Baroque music, architecture, society structure, the way parks were arranged, all of that, all reflect this in their emphasis on an ordered and arranged structure to everything. By the age of 15, Bach was attending a musical conservatory and was becoming very accomplished on the organ. At that time in Germany, there were only 3 paths for a professional musician to make a living. There was writing secular music for one of the royal courts. There was writing of operas in one of the major cities. And then there was working for a city and its churches. And the line was blurry back then, unlike us who have a very divided wall between church and state. In Bach's time, they all intermingled. Well, Bach would spend about 1/3 of his adult musical career working in a royal court, and then about 2/3 working for the church as a church musician. In 1707, at the age of 22, Bach married Barbara, and her last name was Bach also. Over the next 13 years, they had 7 children, 4 of who lived to be adults, which was unfortunately fairly normal for that time. By all accounts, the Bachs had a very loving and warm relationship. During most of this time, Bach worked at the royal court in Leopold for Prince Anhalt-Köthen. Since this was not a church position and was a Calvinist position, many of Bach's best secular works were composed during this period. Prince Leopold himself was an accomplished musician and had a deep, deep friendship with Bach. After the death of Barbara Bach in 1721, Bach married Anna Magdalena. They had 13 children, 6 of who lived to be adults. Like his relationship with Barbara, Bach's relationship with Anna Magdalena was warm and loving. In 1723, Bach took the position of the director of music for the churches and the city of Leipzig. He would remain in that position until his death in 1750. During this time, we have the great output of Bach's sacred music. As an example, for his first 5 years there in Leipzig, he was required every week to compose a 15 to 20 minute cantata to be performed at the Sunday worship service. This cantata was to be based on the lectionary reading for that week. So just think about it. Every Monday, Bach would go to work. He would have to compose a cantata of about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'd have to write it out. He would then have to write out the choral pieces and the pieces for different instruments in the orchestra. He would then have to rehearse them all. On Sunday, they would perform it, and Monday, he'd go back and start all over again. We have 5 years worth of him composing these things, and it's truly amazing pieces of work. An interesting note about Bach is that he never appears to have had some sort of a moral or spiritual crisis in his life. Unlike, say, composers like Beethoven, who had his Heiligen Testament, where he contemplated suicide, or Mozart, or so many other composers who had some kind of a spiritual or moral crisis. Bach never appeared to have that. By 1749, Bach's health had started to decline. He had eye surgery by a quack doctor that resulted in an infection. This same doctor did this surgery on Handel, which ended up killing Handel. Bach died in 1750 at the age of 65 and was buried in an unmarked grave. We mark the end of the Baroque period with Bach's death. After Bach's death, many of his musical manuscripts were actually sold as butcher paper or to wrap fish in. Truly a travesty. His wife, Anna Magdalena, died 10 years later, penniless and homeless. The Episcopal Church to this day celebrates a feast day in Bach's honor every July 28th. So, on July 28th, that's a great day to listen to some good Bach music. Well, speaking of listening, let's get back into listening to St. Matthew Passion. We're going to pick up things at Scene 5. It'll be musical numbers 11 and 12. You can look for them in your handouts to follow along here. The first one is a recitative between the evangelist and Judas, and then there is a soprano aria reacting to Judas's agreeing to betray Jesus. Here's what I want you to listen to as we go through this. Note that in the recitative, number 11, that when Judas sings the word beraten, which is betray, that Bach has scored this with a high note to emphasize it. And also, you may not hear this, but he has scored this whole number in the key of C sharp major. C sharp major has more sharps than any other key. In the Baroque time, this key was used oftentimes to connotate betrayal or capture or treason or lies, all of these sort of things. And so Bach makes good use of this, where Judas has agreed to betray Jesus, he's using that key. Notice as we move into the aria, the first question I want you to ask is, who is singing this? Whose perspective is this from? And when you listen, you realize it's a true stroke of genius. Because what Bach has done is he has scored this and written this from the perspective of Judas's mother. How would Judas's mother reacted to her son agreeing to betray Jesus? How would you react as a mother or as a father to having a son that has agreed to betray Jesus? I also want you to notice the musical picture that's being painted here. Notice there's this regular beating of the rhythm. It's just a very constant, like a heartbeat going on and on and on throughout the whole aria. But then underneath it, you'll hear in the woodwinds and the strings this undulating rhythm that's underneath it, as if it's a snake slithering through the grass. Bach even brings this out even more in the last word of this aria, which is serpent. He scores it for the soprano to sing it in what's called a melisma, where the notes are moving up and down on the scale. One of the other things that may sound familiar to you folks who are baby boomers, shall we say, this piece musically makes use of multiple augmented fourths. Now, you don't have to know what an augmented fourth is, but I know that you've heard them. The augmented fourth is at the midpoint of a scale. And during Bach's time, this was known as the devil note. Well, when we moved into the rock and roll era, in its early days, it made lots of use of augmented fourths throughout the music. In the late 1950s, many Bible Belt preachers railed against this new form of music as the devil music. So as you can see, some things never really change from Bach's time to ours. We also see in this aria one of the most common words throughout the St. Matthew Passion, which is the German word Blut, which is blood. As we said, one of the major themes throughout this work is it was necessary to have suffering and blood for our redemption. And here we see Bach bringing this up for one of the first times, but not the last.
Da ging hin der Zwölfen einer, mit Namen Judas Iskariot, zu den hohen Priestern und sprach: Was wollt ihr mir geben? Ich will ihn euch verraten. Und sie boten ihm 30 Silberlinge. Und von dem an suchte er Gelegenheit, dass er ihn verriete.
We now move to Scene 6 and the Last Supper, the very first Eucharist. And we're going to be going over, in this case here, musical numbers 13 through 16. Here's a couple things I want you to notice in the music as we go through it. In number 14, the chorus is responding about the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, and it's just total pandemonium. It's like much of any large group. When you ask them, well, what are we going to do? And it's just pandemonium, and there is no peer group leader here. Confusion reigns. Notice in number 15, when Jesus proclaims, "One of you will betray me," that the key signature and the notes drop down to a very ominous minor key, connotating that, okay, we've got some bad stuff that's going to happen. And it may be hard to hear, but when he says, "One of you will betray me," the chorus responds with, "Herr, bin ich," Lord, is it I? They sing this, Lord, is it I, 11 times, once for each disciple, minus Judas. Just another example of Bach using musical symbolism throughout the work. The chorus, without even a pause, immediately answers its own question, Lord, is it I, by proclaiming, it is I. They're using a very familiar chorale for the Leipzig church. Once again, as we mentioned, the chorales are used to draw the listener into the action and make it more immediate, more of, oh, this is actually happening right here and right now. This particular chorale was composed by Paul Gerhardt. He was born in 1607 and died in 1676. The melody is actually from a 15th century Renaissance song by Henrik Isaac entitled "Innsbruck, I Must Leave You." It was a very popular secular song, and as was oftentimes the case, secular melodies were used then for sacred chorales. Bach uses the chorus now, acting as all of the sinful people in need of grace. They stand before Jesus and confess, yes, I too would betray you.
Aber am ersten Tage der süßen Brot traten die Jünger zu Jesu und sprachen zu ihm. Wo willst du das sprach, geht hin in die Stadt zu einem und sprecht zu ihm. Der Meister lässt dir sagen, meine Zeit ist hier. Ich will bei dir die Ostern halten mit meinen Jüngern. Und die Jünger täten, wie ihnen Jesus befohlen hatte, und bereiteten das Osterlamm. Und am Abend satzte er sich zu Tische mit den 12. Und da sie aßen, sprach er, wahrlich, ich sage euch, einer unter euch wird mich verraten. Und sie wurden sehr betrübt und hoben an, ein jeglicher unter ihnen, und sagten zu ihm, Herr,
Numbers 17, 18, and 19, we see the institution of the Eucharist, the Last Supper as it's oftentimes called. And here it's Bach has scored this in a somber mode, but also in a hopeful way oftentimes. Notice that as Bach is oftentimes doing on these things, he has a scene where he has the narration and then he brings in a soloist to reflect upon what all it means. And we do this with the soprano. Notice on number 18, as the soprano comes in, the oboes are intertwining within each other, emphasizing the phrase swimming with tears. So here Bach is using the scores for the orchestra to complement the singer in this regard. In this aria, Bach brings into focus three of his major themes of this passion: Jesus' love for mankind, Jesus' physical shedding of blood for our sins, and our thankfulness for what he has done. And in a very upbeat ending to this, in number 19, Bach moves us out of this somber mood, at least temporarily, of the Last Supper, and he brings us into a light and airy dance-like number. It's a theme of gratitude that's being expressed by the soprano, a gratitude for the redemption that we've got. And notice the wording of the final phrases. It just resonates with the Reformation theme that Jesus' grace is for all, and it's available to all in need.
Antwortete und sprach: Der mit der Hand mit mir in die Schüssel tauchet, der wird mich verraten, des Menschen Sohn geht zwar dahin, wie von ihm geschrieben steht, doch wehe dem Menschen, durch welchen des Menschen Sohn verraten wird. Es wäre ihm besser, dass derselbige Mensch noch nie geboren wäre. Da antwortete Judas, der ihn verriet, und sprach: Bin ich's, Rabbi? Er sprach zu ihm: Du sagest. Da sie aber aßen, nahm Jesus das Brot, dankete und brach's und gab's den Jüngern und sprach: Nehmet, esset, das ist mein Leib. Und er nahm den Kelch und dankete, gab ihnen den und sprach: Trinket alle daraus, das ist mein Blut des Neuen Testaments, welches vergossen wird für viele zur Vergebung der Sünden. Ich sage euch, ich werde von nun an nicht mehr von diesem Gewächs des Weinstocks trinken, bis an den Tag, da ich's neu trinken werde mit euch in meines Vaters Reich.
We now move to scene 7 in the Garden of Gethsemane. A couple of musical notes that I want you to hear. First off, on number 20, the evangelist recitative, notice as he is singing about climbing Mount Olives, that the cello of the continuo does a beautiful 13-note rising scale, musically painting a picture of a climb up the mountain. And as Jesus sings, "The flock shall be scattered," if you listen, you'll hear the violins doing a run up the scale as if running away, and then they quickly move back down the scale as if hiding. We'll see a similar motif at the very end of this part 1. But what I really want to talk about mostly is number 21. We come to now probably the most famous chorale in this work, O Hab wat Blut en Wunden. This is universally known as the Passion Chorale. This chorale is known in English-speaking churches as O Sacred Head Sore Wounded. We find it hymn 168 in our Episcopal hymnal. A more literal translation would probably be O Head Full of Blood and Wounds. Bach will use this chorale 5 times in the Passion. Each time he will use a different stanza. In this case, he's using the 5th stanza. He will also use different keys and or harmonizations each time. In this version, Bach uses a very simple, almost innocent harmonization where the music always resolves properly. This musically echoes the disciples' resolve that they shall not leave you. Later, we'll hear versions where Bach will leave us musically unsure and unresolved, reflecting how most lives are often lived. His choice of stanza 5 here reminds us that God will not only sustain us, but will be our delight. This chorale was written by Paul Gerhardt, who we've already had one of his chorales before. He combined a secular tune with a German translation of a Latin poem in this case. The Latin poem was written in the 11th century by a French Benedictine abbot, Bernard of Clairvaux. His poem meditates on the various parts of Christ's body hanging on the cross, moving from his feet to his knees, his hands, his pierced side, his breast, his heart, and finally his head, from which this chorale derives its name. Benedict of Clairvaux was Dante Alighieri's final guide in his Divine Comedy. Bernard also played a role in the Dan Brown 2013 novel Inferno, if you want to go back and read that. The tune for this chorale actually started as a secular song called My Mind's Confused Within Me, written in 1590 by Hans Leo Hassler. This secular song and the tune has oftentimes been referred to as a 16th century all shook up. The first verse of this, translated in English, would go, My mind's confused within me, made thus by a tender gal. I'm utterly astray, my heart hurts badly. I have no rest both night and day. I ever lament. I keep on sighing, crying, in sorrow, almost spent. Of note, this may be a very familiar tune. Paul Simon used this song in 1973 to his hit song American Tune. This was probably in the midst of Paul Simon's bad hair and bad mustache phase. So let's take a listen to this music and go through it together.
Und da sie den Lobgesang gesprochen hatten, gingen sie hinaus an den Ölberg. Da sprach Jesus zu ihnen, in dieser Nacht werdet ihr euch alle ärgern an mir, denn es steht geschrieben, ich werde den Hirten schlagen, und die Schafe der Herde werden sie nicht zerstreuen. Wenn ich aber auferstehe, will ich vor euch hingehen in Galiläa.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end this session than with that beautiful hymn. The Passion Chorale is one of those pieces of music that has moved people throughout the centuries, and Bach is going to use it 4 more times throughout this work, each time in a slightly different way, and I think you'll find them equally as moving. When we come back on our 3rd session, we're going to pick up with Jesus predicting that Peter will deny him 3 times. We'll move into the prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane and the agony of Jesus wanting to see if this cup might pass him by, his arrest, and the scattering of all of his disciples. So, until the next session, I will look forward to seeing you. Thanks a lot. Bye.